I made a video last year about not thinking in terms of vertical chord progressions, but instead thinking about parts, individual melodies that move linearly to create verticals, aka chords. Depending on your background, this may seem like a new concept, a new way of thinking about harmony, but it's actually kind of the opposite. It's been around a lot longer than chord charts. So what's the problem with vertical thinking when it comes to chord progressions? Well, depending on your goals or the kind of music you're making, absolutely nothing. It's a great, effective way to write a progression. But it's become so prevalent in popular musical genres that I think it's worth exploring an alternative way of thinking. One that was used to create a lot of music that has withstood the test of time, centuries in some cases, which I'm not sure is going to be the case for all of the music being made today. I could be wrong. Rick Beato made me say that. While there's nothing inherently wrong with thinking vertically, there are a couple of things that producers tell me they struggle with quite often that can arise as a result of thinking this way. And there's one easy technique that I've found to kind of break myself out of this form of thinking and start to come up with maybe some fresher ideas that move in a more linear fashion and kind of tell a musical story. One of the most common questions that I get is, how do I get unstuck from a 4-bar or 8-bar pattern or loop? The design of modern DAWs and sequencers kind of leads us down this road. It's easy to see why we can get sort of stuck in this trap. We spend most of our time as producers and composers staring at a grid, and it's a grid that's pretty much divided into groups of 4. 4 beats to a bar, 4 bars to a pattern, 4 patterns to a sequence. From there, it's very easy to start to think of chords as just vertical blocks that we can just drop into place and drag around on the grid, and it all starts to feel a little bit paint by numbers or a little repetitive. The chords start to feel isolated from one another. We don't fully understand how they relate from one to the next. But no chord in and of itself is good or bad. It's all about the context in which we use them. It's really all about how they relate to one another. A chord can spoil the next chord. A chord can set up the next chord. But when we think of them as isolated entities, vertical blocks that we've dropped into place, it's kind of hard for us to think about it that way. And we certainly aren't thinking about how every single note in the chord relates to every single note in the next chord. We might end up with too many of the same notes in the first chord that the second chord has, and that kind of serves to spoil the second chord. My composition teacher used to call this telegraphing the second chord. So it ruins its sort of freshness and harmonic surprise. An example might be going from a C major to an E minor. The E minor is sort of a paler version of the C major chord because they share too many of the same notes. And unless that's the effect that we want to have, we might want to avoid that. Or something I don't hear many people talk about is we may be using 2 chords that are not even from the same harmonic language. Now, bear with me for just a minute. Maybe our first chord is tertian, or it's built in thirds. And then the second chord goes to chordal harmony. It creates a sort of dichotomy that sometimes we're not even aware we're creating. This breaks the harmonic consistency of the passage. It's kind of like me starting this sentence in English and switching to French halfway through. It just serves to confuse the listener. Now, if that's our intention and we're trying to create that sort of dichotomy, then awesome. But I think most of the time this happens just through simple lack of awareness that this is even a thing, because it's not something that I hear many people talk about. And it is something that I hear a lot of composers doing, and I'm not sure it's always intentional. Because oftentimes, I think we're just dropping chords vertically onto the grid, and they might sound great when they're isolated, but we're not really taking into account whether they belong in the same musical sentence with one another. I think the quickest way to start thinking linearly is to use fewer notes. Strip it down to just 2 parts. Just two notes at a time. There's less to think about, there's fewer distractions, and you are absolutely forced to make those two parts, because they're the only ones, really, really strong and really independent and capable of standing on their own. Earlier this week, I was working with one of my coaching clients on an analysis of the Bach C major prelude, and we took special note that if we stacked all of those arpeggios into blocked chords and just played the outer parts, it still worked. There was still a clear melodic phrase that had its own shape and structure, and the linear writing created the vertical harmonies that Bach uses throughout the piece. So that's why I said a good exercise is to play the outer voices.
Right, yeah, it's very clear now.
You can hear the phrases.
Yeah, exactly. Much more clear now. Yeah.
A lovely sort of
Very.
question and answer thing going on, right? It's kind of period structure. It's conversational. It has a shape and a development to it. Those two parts could work very well on their own, you know. And what makes this piece difficult for players is they just see a bunch of notes. Like every piano student I've ever taught this to, it's been a challenge initially, some more than others, to get them to see this, like the interaction between the parts. So we always do it blocked. It helps them see the chords, but it more importantly gives them a sense of musical direction, because when they just look at a bunch of 16th notes, they think note, 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 note. Wrong, right? The whole thing is going according to the two parts we just played. Like that's the shape of it. If this is a concept that you've never even considered, I have made a new PDF guide specifically going more in depth on harmony, which I think is one of the most important aspects of music and composition that maybe doesn't get talked about quite enough. It has more examples of what I'm talking about today. It goes a little bit more in depth and is absolutely free, and you can find it down in the description below if you're interested. Now, I am by no means comparing it to Bach, but I used a similar approach, a similar technique, this sort of stripped down approach in my track Turning. I started with a bed of textures and sound design that I really liked, and then I started improvising, but I was really struggling coming up with a progression that I really liked. Everything was very vertical, very blocky, very looped, and sort of didn't seem to develop or go anywhere. So I decided to limit myself to improvising with just two notes at a time and focusing on how those two notes interacted with one another and where they went linearly, what story they told melodically. So the first phrase went something like this. This was an improvisation, and there is one thing I don't like about that, and I'll tell you why. My ears immediately perk up or notice a weakness in one spot. There, I've doubled. Basically, I have the same note in both parts. And when you only have two parts, when you double, you really only have one part for that particular moment. So that, to me, is a point of weakness. I must have realized that during the improvisational process, because the next time I do this. So that not only changes the cadence, it also is born out of me trying to avoid that weakness that I was somehow able to pick up on in real time. So the whole thing So I haven't changed the top part, haven't changed the melody at all, but just by changing the bass the second time, it creates sort of a period structure, right? So I have like A, B, A, C. It's a little different the second time. Creates a new harmony to end on. Very different than... It's very different the second time. We end up in a new place harmonically, and I've also eliminated that point of harmonic weakness by not doubling the second time. So the whole thing feels stronger. Now, this is a super simple example, but it is stripped down to the point that we can really see the effect that these small changes can have. They can have a really big impact when you start to stack all of these small changes on top of each other. And once you develop the ability to think more linearly, you start to see that even these linear lines, these horizontal melodic lines, they have their own harmonic identity, which sounds like a pretty good topic for another video. If you want to see more composition-related videos, I've been making a bunch of them over the last year or so, and they are conveniently collected into this playlist right here.